We're fairly sure. We've just screened our final participant of 12 in the pilot study. We finally got a couple men, which took a while. Don't know why. I have some theories about that. But because I am a new face and I'm only an aspiring expert at this point, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my background and how I came to be doing this work. I think it does speak to our theme of building a sustainable psychedelic research, and up on the kind of lofty visionary level, I saw what I thought was a change that needed to take place in the world and realized the only way we're going to get there is to put it into action. I had been a television and news producer for about 9 years, and then I segued into a very, very corporate environment. I worked for a major biomanufacturing company. They now use the term human therapeutics, and they're not so sustainable at the moment. I'm not going to mention any names, but they've been in the press a lot lately, so I've sort of had a first-hand glimpse at the big corporate model that isn't really working. But after leading a very mainstream corporate kind of existence for some time, I went out after work one day with friends for a drink at a bar, and they were talking about ecstasy. And my knee-jerk reaction was, oh, you guys don't think you should be messing with this. I don't know, it sounds dangerous. And true to my nature, I got a book. And it was Julie Holland's book, Ecstasy, A Complete Guide. And don't worry, I'm not going to read from notes the whole time. But I brought a copy of the quote that marked the turning point that launched the beginning of my work as a psychedelic researcher and activist. And there's a section in the book where she includes some excerpts from emails that she received from people with chronic mental health problems. She identifies it in the book as schizophrenia. People have different feelings about that term, but this was from a young man who wrote to her after an MDMA experience, and this is what he said. I felt as if my mental problems had washed away. All of my paranoia, all of my reservations about people, all of the pent-up anger and frustration, the bitterness toward my family, all of it had been flushed out with a single dose. I felt like a real person. Every time I read it, I almost cry. I felt like a real person. It has given me freedom from a disease that has plagued me for years, and a bit of that freedom continues on even after the drug wears off. I do not think this is a cure for anything, only a new perspective that should be used wisely. And that catalyzed an entirely new me. I finally got that sense of that mission coming from my heart, and I knew I had to try to effect a positive change in the world just based on reading that one testimonial. I had no prior medical background. I had produced some medical television, so I'd worked with doctors and was fairly comfortable in that world, but I was at a loss for how I might participate. So because of my media background, I was sort of a natural impulse to just call Dr. Holland. I got in touch with her and said, I need to help. I don't know what I can do. She referred me to Rick Doblin, who in turn referred me to Dr. Charles Grobe, the principal investigator at Harbor UCLA for the psilocybin trial, which I'll update you. I'll give you an update in just in a minute. I contacted Dr. Grobe, and I would say by chance, but hanging out here long enough, I know that doesn't make very much sense. I had just landed the worst job ever. I was in the most spiritually deprived beige cubicle hive ever, right around the corner from Harbor UCLA. So I contacted Dr. Grobe and talked to him, and he was kind of scratching his head. He gets kind of approached a lot from graduate students and young doctors, and trying to think of something I could do. And then it came up in the course of conversation that he had been carrying around the most tattered, yellowed box with 35 millimeter slides that he was using for his presentations when he was speaking to medical students and colleagues. And I realized this guy needs a PowerPoint presentation. And he was all too happy to have a volunteer. And I mention it only because I'm hoping to spark ideas in other people's minds of use what you've got in some way if you want to get a foothold in advancing psychedelic research. And over the course of several months, I would meet with him when I had some spare time and created a PowerPoint that kind of enhanced his ability to go out and lecture and have a nice presentation. And then Lorenzo did one as well that was psilocybin oriented, so we kind of helped Dr. Grove in that capacity. And then some time had gone by, a couple years, and I got that phone call that changed my life. How would you like to be the new study coordinator? And you know, I think anytime you have a calling, there's that knee-jerk reaction. You're called to do something, you think you've got the wrong person, me. But thanks very much to the expert mentoring I received from Mary C. She's here in the back of the room. She was an RN who worked on the study for about the first half of the trial, and she took me under her wing and showed me the ins and outs of the administration and the onboarding process when new patients, or pardon me, participants came on board. And the skill set I'd acquired as a TV producer and a project manager were applicable. They were transferable. And the team was extremely gracious about filling in the gaps of my knowledge. And it was a good fit. So enough about me. That's how I came to be doing this work. I've been doing it about 2 years now. So I'm not an expert, but I am one of the few people on the planet right now who's done the FDA-approved, above-board, kind of institutional psychedelic research. Now, I wanted to just get a show of hands. Did anybody hear Dr. Preet Chopra's update on the psilocybin trial here last year? Because I don't want to repeat things too much. Oh, a few of you. Oh, very good. Yeah, we were about halfway at that point, maybe 6 out of 12 participants, and he came in this forum and gave a talk, so I can just sort of bring you up to speed. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but back, I guess it was in 2004, they finally, the team, got approval after years and years of back and forth of jumping through administrative hurdles, got approval from the FDA to work with a mild to moderate dose, an analytical dose of psilocybin, as opposed to a knock yourself out, see God dose, 0.2 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. And the study is they were approved for 12 participants. The study is conducted in a special research wing at the county hospital at Harbor UCLA. There's a room that was used as a sleep study room, so it has a nice big heavy double door, one bed in there. My Burning Man experience came in handy, and Mary C. had already done some great legwork helping with the setting part. We go in before the participants are admitted and hang fabrics and tapestries and bring in flowers and try to create an environment more conducive to having a good journey with psilocybin. During the sessions, we use music, and participants are encouraged to use eye shades to really go within to have an analytical experience. We're a team of 3. Dr. Charles Grobe is the principal investigator. Dr. Preet Chopra, who spoke here last year, was a fellow at the time at Harbor, and he was fantastic, volunteered so much of his time on multiple Saturdays to support the work. And I function as the study coordinator. And together, the 3 of us sort of co-facilitate the sessions. Trying to think about the things that people are really interested in. Nobody has freaked out. We haven't had anybody run screaming for the room or say, I can't wait till this is over, I got to get out of here, or who are you, and whatnot. I would say the least satisfactory outcome were people who didn't have a very strong experience, maybe because of their particular physiology or because of other medications that they're working with. Oh, I should mention it is a it is a study working with people who have stage 4 metastatic cancer. Their prognoses vary widely. It can be any kind of cancer as long as they don't have metastases to the brain. An MRI proving that is required as part of inclusion in the study. No history of major psychiatric disorder, no kidney problems, cardiac problems, and so on. So participants are screened. So although they have advanced cancer, they have a measure of health that, safety first on this study. It is primarily a safety study. And they come in for 2 sessions for a 1-night overnight stay at the hospital. During one session, they'll receive a placebo. During another session, they'll receive the active psilocybin in a capsule form. It is synthesized in a laboratory. We don't use real mushrooms because of the demands of clinical research. It's a very gentle experience so far. The most, the only reports we've had of any discomfort are some very mild queasiness or nausea that was kind of fleeting. So in general, people don't tend to get the cramping and nausea that you can get with mushrooms sometimes. It's a very pleasant ride. They receive the medicine in the morning, and they're usually ready to go home at about 5 in the afternoon. And it's double-blind to us. We never know which time it's going to be the placebo or the active drug. But when I tell people we use a placebo, they usually kind of laugh and say, can't they kind of tell? And the answer to that question is yeah. We usually have a fairly good idea, but it's pretty irrelevant because the work continues. The work starts well before they take the active drug and continues afterwards. So, and as I've mentioned, we've just screened and are ready to onboard our final participant to close this phase of the study and begin thinking about the next protocol for the next phase of the trial. And this is where this talk becomes interactive. I've just designated a handful of areas. I don't know how many we'll get through, but areas where, I'll let you in on a little secret. Psychedelics require such new and subjective and creative ways of thinking when you're approaching them in a clinical setting that we spend, if a participant is very far underwell, we try to be very present and connected to them. It's a bit of a marathon, and sometimes we can't help but start debating amongst ourselves, what do you guys think about this? And what do you think about that? And there are a lot of unanswered questions about how to proceed in a manner that will allow psychedelic research to remain sustainable. We want to avoid roadblocks in terms of the cultural roadblock that occurred in the 60s because of the abuse and misuse out in the general public. We need to adhere to standard methodologies so that institutions like the FDA don't stop the process. So some very deep thinking is required, and I thought who better to ask about some of these ideas. You may tell me something today that I'll jot down a note, and it may find its way into the protocol in some form or another. So before I start introducing, one other quote I just wanted to read to you. Dr. Chopra, the colleague that I mentioned, this is a quote from his presentation here last year that just kind of summarizes what sparked my desire to do this work and keep doing this work. And I have a feeling a lot of people in the room are like-minded. Dr. Chopra said, I think it's kind of ridiculous to be a scientist and a doctor and not investigate and try to understand how we can use these tools in a Western culture safely. That's my orientation. I love being around the visionaries. I love hearing the presentations here about the people who are so lofty and cerebral and inspirational in their thinking. I'm much more pragmatic. I absorb that and then try to figure it out. All right, how do we do it? And that's where I want to enlist your help. So before we begin, does anybody have any questions about the trial in general? Do you need a microphone?
Hi. In your screening of participants, do you look for people who have previous experience with psychedelics?
What a brilliant question. That's one of my bullet points. So let's start there. This is an example of the sorts of things that we debate. Is it important to have experienced journeyers? Let me back up just one step. In doing clinical research, minimizing variability is always, or has been in the past, has been the ideal. So that the drug is the only thing that's different, so you can see if it's having any sort of effect or change. And we, for this study, opted to not make that part of an inclusion or exclusion. We have had people who were very experienced back in the day. We've had some deadheads that really, had a lot of experience with altered states. We have had entirely naive users who have never had a hallucinogen or psychedelic experience before in their lives. But that is a good question going forward, to minimize variability, or do we allow for some flexibility to accommodate the special needs of psychedelics? Does anybody in the room have an opinion about whether that matters? Should everybody be a naive user who's never done it before, or should they have some experience? Both? Yep.
Let me use this one.
Hi. It seems like you should have both so that you could compare. You should document the differences between maybe the people who've done it before and the new people, and just that's an interesting thing in and of itself. And to not to discount it, but to work that into the study.
Yeah.
That seems.
Yeah, I happen to agree. And when people say, what instruments are you using to capture that and evaluate that and measure that, that's the new terrain that we're trying to walk wisely and carefully. I do think in the future it would be an asset to have more sophisticated models for the studies to accommodate comparisons between naive and experienced users within the same study, but clearly delineated. Anybody else have any
I
thoughts?
agree with what you just said, that because it's so hard, the exclusionary thing is such a problem anyhow. So if you don't exclude anybody, that's whether they have or haven't, but if you do track them separately, I would love to see if you get more positive results of one group or the other, or if it's just the same. That's a really curious thing.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area to explore. You have a mic? Oh, good.
It seems to me in that I know with this particular study that there's some difficulty in getting people to partake in the study because of the end-stage cancer issue and geographic issues. And so I think that it's great that you have anyone can participate. I think that it probably makes this study actually even happening to be easier. But it could be that this is a point that should be stressed with all psychedelic researchers, that worked into the data that they collect. They collect data related to the statistics of naive users compared to experienced users, and then if all the different studies that anyone is doing does that, there can be a meta-analysis of that data later as a project. So it doesn't have to actually be something that is a goal of the study. It can just be something that each researcher is encouraged to do.
Yeah, there's actually a team at NYU right now. I don't know if people are aware that they're going to replicate our study, and they've called and consulted us on certain points about refining their protocol and so on, and that's something I can pass along and say, hey, if you haven't done so already, you might want to think about starting to collect data comparing naive and experienced users. So, anything else on this topic before I thought the next one?
I'm just curious about, is the goal of the study for healing the cancer? Or is the goal of the study for contextualizing the experience of the being?
Fantastic question. I should have clarified that earlier. This is a psychiatric trial. We're not focusing on curing cancer. It's an anxiety study. Cancer and anxiety. We're looking, thank you very much. We're looking primarily at anxiety, secondary to that, depression, and attitudes and perceptions of pain. And I'm very careful in the recruiting process. If I pick up any inklings that someone in desperation is looking for a miracle cure for their cancer, I'll very gently say, I just want to make sure that you understand we're not looking at how it will influence your cancer. It's to help with anxiety and challenges you're having, existential angst and end of life issues and quality of life at the end of life. So thank you. Good question. Anyone else before I move on? Okay, this one, it doesn't seem like it should be such a big deal, but it kind of is. It's kind of a fun one to ponder. The use of music. Do you have a set playlist where everybody has the same set of music and they all hear the same thing in the interest of minimizing variability, as they're doing on the MDMA and PTSD study, the MAP-sponsored study in North Carolina? Or do you customize your playlist to accommodate the unique tastes and needs and attitudes of the participant? Because you lose your variability. I have an opinion, but I'm curious if anybody here has any thoughts.
What size is your study sample?
Do you want a microphone?
Use the microphone here. We're trying to record.
She can just repeat the
Yeah,
question.
yeah, okay.
No, the
Yeah,
repeat question. It's going out on the radio, so we're trying to have
Okay, okay. Can you repeat it one more time?
What size
What's
is your
this?
study sample?
At present, it's a pilot study. It's small, 12 participants.
It seems like how
Yeah.
with that size of study, it would seem like it would add too much variability. If you had 10 times more, then you could bring in more variables. But with such a small study, I would keep things as standardized as possible to be able to tease apart your main variable,
Yeah.
and that is what on anxiety reduction.
Yeah, yeah.
If I think about it, if your goal is to figure out how to kind of cure or alleviate anxiety and depression and things, if someone has anxiety about, like if you choose classical music for everybody, and some people have anxiety about classical music perhaps from their upbringing or something, then you're basically countering what you're trying to achieve. So it seems like asking them while there is a variability thing, it seems like asking people what kind of music soothes them and makes them comfortable. Those types of things would be helpful. However, there is that, but then we're introducing variability. We're introducing something that already makes them less anxious. And then is it the music or is it the drug? So.
Yeah, yeah. And playing devil's advocate, sometimes you have to be mindful of keeping anybody in their happy floaty place for too long if what they need to do is some cathartic hard work facing some fears. Do you have a mic? Do you need a mic?
Why have music at all?
Why have music at all? Good question. I've been challenged on this one before by some pretty powerful thinkers. I think part of it is pragmatic. You're in a hospital room with 3 people in chairs looking at you. You need some place to go. I personally just tend to think of the music as a little boat you can hop on when you're journeying and ride to wherever you need to go. I'll let you know at this point. We have not standardized our playlist, but it's interesting to hear the opinions of people who support the view that perhaps we should. And some participants have had cancers, neck and above type issues where they're very sensitive to sound and have requested, can I just have some silence for the next 2 hours? And to kind of summarize where we've landed for this particular phase of the trial, this baby step, the skills of a DJ have really been brought forward, meeting people where they are. The general rules that we follow are we tend to avoid English lyrics, especially anything leading, no tearjerkers, nothing, oh, we're going to really make them cry right now. And, we try not to be too leading. And we found that organic, percussion-based music, didgeridoo, drums, jungle-inspired type music works well. A lot of, Indian type music, you may have mantras or something that are, there may be human voices in lyrics, but we tend to avoid anything that would suggest where the participant should head. We've had some funny experiences. Some people said, oh, I love classical music. I want to hear classical music. And we'll play the classical music and they'll start laughing. Like, oh no, this isn't working at all. I thought this was a great idea. And so the compromise we've come to, we've got an iPod, and we've got building a large library. We have some old standards. I'll share this with you. The soundtrack to The Mission tends to work for a lot of people. There are pieces of music through trial and error we learn. This works fairly well. Doing some sort of these new age tapes you get, chakra meditation, the first track is at the root chakra, and had some interesting outcomes. I think it helped facilitate well. Yeah.
I'll add a little thing that I learned what happened to the study Myron Stolaroff did back in the 60s, where at Menlo Park they ran about 350 people through their program. And it was before LSD became illegal, and it was all LSD, and it was about enhancing creativity. It wasn't healing. But I asked him about the music, and they always used only classical music. They would allow people to bring their music, and they'd say, well, is it okay if we start off with a little classical, even though you don't like it, and then we'll put yours on after a while? And he says, to the best of his memory, that there were only one or two people that wanted their music after they kind of got into the session on classical music. Now, I personally have tried classical music a lot of times with sessions, and I'm more of a Pink Floyd guy myself, but they only used classical music, and they didn't really, they kind of allowed the people to bring their own music, but they never wound up playing it.
One of the very recent participants in the study, when I inquired what kind of music do you like, we'd like to have some of that available. Oh, I pretty much only listen to classical and jazz. That's what I like, classical and jazz. And on the second session, I had a playlist set up that was more, for lack of a better word, new agey world music, good, really good, juicy journeying music. And this person was a naive user. And we're fairly sure, we don't know, but we're fairly sure the first session was the placebo. And the second session would have been the first time this person had been altered, and, with a substance. And as the effect of the psilocybin started to come on, there was this little knowing smirk, this little and she said, where I'm going a little better than you're right, classical didn't work. We asked her later, why were you giggling at that point in the session? She said, you knew better about the music than I did. So, yeah. Yeah, that's, again, the skills of the DJ tend to come in handy, meeting people where they are and the needs in that session at that moment, being ready to switch it up if you have to. But it's a good point.
Yeah. Well, why music at all? Why not just sound effects, nature sounds, things like that?
Yeah. Well, that was the question John just asked, why music at all? Yeah, that's a consideration. I actually did download a compilation CD called Nature Sounds, and it's crickets chirping in the woods and waterfalls and waves crashing on the beach. We've experimented a bit with that. It works fairly well. For a 6-hour session, I don't know how people's stamina would work to listen to, I guess you listen to crickets chirping all night if you're out in the woods, but again, you guys are bringing up such wonderful points. It's really speaking to this idea psychedelics require new ways of thinking and new paradigms. If it's going to be sustainable, all these little intricacies need to be worked out. Or experimented with in a responsible way. Yes.
Since the setting sounds somewhat sterile, what do you do, like cognitive therapy in the session, or is it just like they're there and wherever they want to go, you go, or how does that?
Yeah, I can give you a sense of kind of the standard model. There is pre-work. The participants meet with Dr. Grobe. There's a psychiatric evaluation and kind of assess where they are. And there is intention setting work. What are you hoping to get from this experience? One recent participant was rather experienced. This person was a burner, is a burner actually, and so I've done all sorts of experimenting and so on, and hadn't journeyed with intention before for healing, and his real revelation. It was really a different experience for him. So some people have journeyed with intention before, but regardless if they have or haven't, they're encouraged to talk that over with the team. And each session begins with kind of a grounding ceremony. We call in the 4 directions and create a sacred space. That's part of the unofficial protocol, but I hope someday it makes its way into the official record. But we are mindful of, finding out what people's spiritual orientations are. We've had people who are very devout Buddhists. We've had atheists. And again, that speaks to is there a one-size-fits-all solution in a clinical setting for psychedelics? During the session, they're encouraged to go within. It needs to be, sort of analytical. We're not chit-chatting. However, every hour on the hour, I take a blood pressure and sort of get a general sense. I don't want to be in people's face asking all the time, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you high yet? What are you doing? What are you doing?" Nothing would be more annoying, but just kind of with gesture. But I tell you, a lot of times we can tell how people are doing. One recent participant started out kind of like this at the beginning of the session, and right about the time we thought they'd be coming on, just spread wide open. And, we try to read those signals. Where are they? Are they struggling? Are they in a content place? And I tell them, I'm going to tap you gently on the shoulder. If you want to stay in that deep place, just stick out your arm. I'll put the cuff on, and then drop it. So we talk about signals that they can give so that we're not too intrusive. Around hour 4 or 5, we check in to make sure they're not too dissociative and kind of ask them, we know, especially the naive users, we know this is kind of an ineffable experience, but can you give us some idea of where you are and check on them? Some people have sat, bolt upright when we least expected it, ripped off the mask and said, "I'm getting all sorts of answers to questions," and blah, 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 and they want to talk about it in the moment. Again, we try to meet them where we are, going back to that variability issue. Should there be a rule? No talking until the end. Or you're required to check in for 5 minutes every hour on the hour. Anybody have any thoughts?
Something like that would be extremely frustrating and annoying. If you're feeling like you have to get out what you're thinking and you're not allowed to, I get, I think they really just make things worse for people. And that all the time you were talking about this, I was just thinking the limits of this scientific investigation process are, this is such a soft science kind of thing that applying the hard science rules is kind of going to mess it up, actually. Like if you're trying to learn about reducing anxiety, it's not physics, And so the variability has to be there. Otherwise, I mean, if you're really trying to reduce people's anxiety, not just study one, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
maybe it's music and mushrooms together, you know?
Yeah.
And that's, you know, and being able to talk, I mean, not being able to talk, that's horrible. Don't do that.
No, they know at any point that we're there. We try
Yeah.
to not bring novels
Yeah.
to read and so on. If you want to communicate with us at any point,
Mhm.
we leave it up to them.
Like making
Yeah.
somebody feel like a lab rat would not reduce anxiety, you know?
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah, good point. Anyone else? Yeah.
I wanted to respond to that as well. For me, psychedelics and life in general, my science would be a subjective one, not an objective one. And I just find it so fascinating that you're articulating in between the zones of this purely subjective and the objective view that science holds. I don't even know how you can do it.
It's a fine line. It's walking in those two worlds is a challenge, but I know I care about this so much. I know there's going to be an FDA to deal with for the foreseeable future. Other regulatory agencies, an IRB, we're responsible to, and the, you know, data safety monitoring reports, you know, renewal reviews, all that. Those P's and Q's have to be in order. And that's, I mean, I'm here soliciting input on new.
Okay, so what I wonder is whether there's experience with other kinds of studies, like if you're doing a study of whether particular surgery works. So you want to know if a particular kind of like heart bypass surgery works. That seems like also an environment where you couldn't control all the variables. You know, the idea is that you have a surgeon and he goes in and he realizes that every person's body is going to be a little different. And he makes these adjustments, he or she makes these adjustments based on the needs of that body. It's not like you can say, okay, first you're going to cut this particular thing, then you're going to patch it together in this particular way. There's this idea that if you have a trained person doing it, that they can make those subjective calls in response to the situation. And so I wonder if those principles can be brought to, for example, things like having a skilled DJ, having these things.
That's essentially what we've been doing, but we're flying under the radar a little bit right now. After the study's published, I'm curious if there'll be more scrutiny and how the subsequent protocols will be reviewed. But I think at present, nobody's too disturbed by our somewhat flexible approach. How are we doing for time? Should I just keep going here? I mentioned a little bit earlier about the notion of using a placebo, which is really funny. The drug comes in, I'll share with you the placebo we use is niacin. The thinking being niacin can create a flush, a creeping feeling. It doesn't really leave you feeling altered, and truth be told, I don't think we've fooled anybody. But a lot of times people giggle when you talk about using a placebo in a psychedelic study. The Roland Griffith study out of Johns Hopkins, if you haven't heard about it, it's worth doing a Google search and reading about it. Fascinating study with psilocybin. I believe they used healthy controls and at a higher dose, but they use Ritalin. And a little bit of minor controversy bubbled up about that. Is that really appropriate to be giving people and so on? But they did have a little bit more of a placebo effect. It did fool people a bit more. But if you were designing your psychedelic study, what would you use for a placebo? This is something we debate in those off hours when we're just chatting amongst ourselves. Anybody have any thoughts or comments? Yeah.
Well, I mean, if your goal is anxiolysis, then if you thought about using an active anxiolytic and comparing the two, and then comparing them short term, like, okay, I took this Valium versus the psilocybin, and right now I feel mellow. but hopefully what you're looking for is longer term outcomes with the psilocybin that they can carry forward.
I'm making a note.
Well, really, the reason they don't do that is because they're using Valium or something. That has to be stopped. All of those things have to be stopped so that you
Have to be what? Stop. Those they might be on Valium already.
Right, you have to clean off of that. Yeah, you're not. So you don't want to know how good Valium is. We already know Valium reduces anxiety.
I'd like to address the use of sound. I'd like to address the use of sound. In the ayahuasca traditions, the sound takes you on the journey for healing, and sound can evoke emotion. So when you have somebody dealing with anxiety, and there could be lots of reasons for anxiety, death is approaching, but they may have issues with their parents or something that happened as a child and they want to deal with, and the sound will help to evoke the emotion, and the music can help them to free up easily because sound can really tap into emotion. Oh, I'm back. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
All right, we're done with that.
Here's one that I thought this group might have some interest in. Oh, yeah.
What? What exactly is the point of the placebo at all?
Mary C., you might want to speak to this, but I think it's adhering to standard methodologies to get the trial approved. Is it more sophisticated than that? Yeah. All those discussions took place before. I know.
I think also perhaps you might want to explain that a phase 1 study is really a safety study to prove that you won't kill a dying person with psilocybin.
Exactly. It's primarily a safety study. We're looking at efficacy a bit, but with such a small sample. It's really taking a baby step to reinitiate the work that was cut short a couple decades ago. So erring on the side of caution really seemed like the best way to go. So, yeah.
I just wanted to note really quickly, it would obviously just be, when you were talking about collecting statistics on the experiences of naive versus experienced users, and I was just reminded of what Matt was saying about certain ayahuasca shamans who don't need the drug anymore to experience, or don't need the ayahuasca plant anymore even to experience or enter that space. So I think the placebo effect would be really interesting in terms of how they affected naive and experienced users, whether or not either group. I'm thinking, just my opinion here, that the experience, even though it seems counterintuitive, that maybe the experienced user might have more an effect of the placebo because they're expecting something. Maybe they could kind of call that up within themselves, or So I just think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah. Do you just want to shout? Or?
There's a mic right up
Okay.
And I apologize that you do that. We're sending this out on the radio at the same time. So.
I just wanted to ask why you have to use synthesized psilocybin, because I have experience with about 25 different strains of cubensis, and all of them have different personalities. The Gulf Coast strains are very different from Mazatepec. The Thai strain is very different from Ecuador. The Hawaiian Cyan is very different than all of them. There's some that cause more anxiety than others, that have bitchier personalities, and there's some that will bring on a lot more bliss than others.
Did you just read my mind? That's the next note on my list, synthetic versus natural. It's another debated area that people sort of go back and forth. When I tell people it's a pill and it's synthesized in a laboratory, some people are very opposed to that. Oh, it's a natural plant medicine. Why are you messing with what Mother Nature gave us, and so on? And there may be others in the room have different opinions. Again, I think it goes back to that same old story: standardization, safety, minimizing variability. How do you assess the data if someone got a very powerful batch of mushrooms, somebody got a very mild? It's to keep the experience as consistent as possible. One thing that's come up, and I'm no expert on what I'm talking about here, but there's just been some of these little murmurs. The dosage is based on body weight, but some people knowledgeable in the psychopharmacology of all of this think, that might not be the best measure. Brain weight may very well be the determinant, because the people in our study who are heavy are obviously getting a higher dose than our little petite people. So another challenge, psychedelics present new ways of thinking. Anybody else have any thoughts on synthetic versus natural? I mean, I always think of the comment Maria Sabina made. She had an opportunity to experience synthetic psilocybin, and her assessment was the little people are in there. So, and the experienced users have said it feels like a psilocybin experience, just maybe a little cleaner, a little less toxic without the nausea and so on, maybe a little less visual. You don't get quite such a light show and so on, but similar to the natural substance. So
I was just talking with Sasha about that this morning, because he was talking about a conversation he had with Terence McKenna, where McKenna was going on about DMT and it was natural, and Terence was really into the naturals versus the synthetics, and the two of them discussed that from time to time. And he was saying how important DMT was. It's in your body and the plants, and Sasha said, but you know, they synthesized it in the 1920s before they discovered it anywhere else. And so, of course, Sasha is into, he believes in the chemistry. The only thing I think, the comment you were making about the wide variety, I think is really important, because they have these synergistic effects. It's not just the psilocybin, there's the other synergistic effects. So I guess for a scientific study, if you want control, that's really the only way you get control, because you don't really know what other ingredients are tweaking you. But I still kind of go with the natural myself over the synthetic, even though there's not supposed to be a difference.
I just had the thought that you should use the synthetic because of the control thing, being able to control it, and because you have to. But that once the data gets out, I think it gets out into the mainstream, that people will be able to do their own thing with the natural. They'll go, oh, it works. Okay, well, hook me up with some mushrooms.
I think if this was a huge issue, if this is something that you see coming up with the people who want to partake in the study, and that it's a big enough issue that it's a concern, it seems totally reasonable to contract, if this is possible, someone to grow mushrooms and extract the natural psilocybin from them. And that probably could be done cheaper than having Dave make up a batch. So
that goes to the sustainability theme of the talk. Yeah, going forward, I think it would be most people's preference to start from a more natural place. It's interesting, this nature versus, clinical, technical. A lot of people, when they find out the study's in a hospital, some people have declined to participate because they're like, I want to be in the forest, I want to be in the meadow, and I have fantasies of little yurts in a beautiful meadow where we'll be able to do this someday, but time being, we're kind of stuck where we are, just taking baby steps. Did you have a question?
I missed the beginning of your discussion, but I do have a little story that's interesting about synthetic versus natural, and hopefully it hasn't been told before I came in, but some friends of ours who are scientists and entheophiles took some synthetic DMT and went down to the Amazon to meet with some elder shaman that they had been working with, some ayahuasqueros. And for those of you who don't know, there's one part of the ayahuasca batch is usually the chacruna leaf, which contains DMT. And so our friends wanted to invite these medicine men from the Amazon to try the synthetic and smoke it with them. And these guys, of course, are big tobacco smoker shamans, so they're used to the idea of taking in medicines that way. And so they agreed, and my friend told me that the shaman took a big hit of the synthetic DMT, and he closed his eyes, and he didn't say anything for 10 minutes. And then the first thing he said is, he looked at them and he said, "We can get lots more leaf." Because they told him it was an extraction from the leaf, even though it was synthetic, because it's like their way of trying to understand. Or they didn't say it was an extraction, but they said it's a very strong form of the leaf. It's like, and so the guy, he was like, we can get a lot more leaf, and he was wanting them to teach them how to make this, So, that's just kind of a humorous story, but there's also the similar story of Hofmann going down to the Amazon, or to Maria Sabina, and was that already mentioned? And she confirmed that these are the same spirits I work with. So, sorry if I was repetitive.
How are we doing for time, Lorenzo? I can keep going all day, all night.
Well, since our next speaker isn't here, and you do have more time, but we'll just keep going until he gets here if you want to, or until you get tired. So, or until you get tired. So.
Okay. Segueing then into another one of these topics. One thing we debate back and forth is other indications. Quite frankly, it was easier to get a study with psychedelics approved with people who have advanced, I always hate to say terminal, but likely to be terminal at some point. And that idea has always kind of sat with me kind of funny. You don't have long to live anyway, might as well see what this does to you. I hope we move beyond that model as soon as we can. But we debate saying, all right, when we've proven the safety, and assuming we do, who else might benefit? There is a challenge working within the current structure that in order to get something prescribed as a prescription medication, it needs to be approved for every indication, which means it needs to be studied for every indication. There's, as far as I'm aware, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no sort of blanket, this is safe, you can do what you want. So it may take some time to hop from indication to indication if a new model and some exceptions don't open up. But if you were creating a study using psilocybin or even other psychedelics, what other indications? And I'll just throw out there that OCD in psilocybin has Dr. Moreno's trial they've looked at that. MDMA and post-traumatic stress disorder. There are other studies in the work, and several that are about to be approved if all goes as planned. But what are your thoughts about other indications that should be looked at using the sort of clinical trial model, if any? Anybody have any thoughts?
I think that there needs to be a lot more studies done across the population of the United States on a large scale, starting with schools, universities, maybe from the middle school on up. And
for any particular indications, or
a new drug education program for a reality check. I'm being facetious.
Gotcha. Okay. Anybody have any thought? Yeah?
What about working with prisoners? Because that seems so promising long ago.
In terms of working with that population, I don't know if I'm qualified to say. It's not something we've discussed. But I think more specific than finding a target population to study or to recruit from, for what indications are we prescribing or introducing the substance? What are we trying to heal or address or assuage or whatever?
Recidivism. So I know like Timothy and Alfred and all these people, and there were a bunch of other, I think Humphrey Osmond was doing that.
Yeah.
So I can't remember. I know there was a lot of things for personality change. Like the only thing that I know Ibogaine is kind of trying to do personality.
Yeah.
So just in terms of trying to reorganize personality and reduce recidivism and make people look at their lives differently, in terms of that, not just as a recruiting population.
That just sits with me as I hope we get there. It seems as if there's some intermediate steps we need to take before we're working on kind of more abstract, less tangible, measurable, things.
I'm thinking that in prison you'd get a lot of people with post-traumatic stress disorder, pretty serious manifestations of mental illness and things like that, be a good population to pull from.
And you can measure you can measure recidivism, right? So it's like kind of long term, but it's not. You wouldn't just look at whether they feel like they're not criminals anymore, but whether they end up getting arrested again within, and just follow them. So it's a measurable. That's measurable.
Yeah, the work that Osmond and those guys were doing with alcoholics, and the recidivism rate went very low, but then there was no follow-up after everything got shut down. But it wasn't criminals, it was alcoholics that they were doing the studies with, which is easy to measure something like that, or easier.
Yeah.
I think a really good indication to study would be possibly for people with severe anger management, who tend to have problems. As far as prisoners, people who are in there for violent crimes or have anger management issues, just because it's a psychological disease. But it's like Matt was saying about his mother and colon cancer, and carrying anger around, I think tends to affect you physically a lot as well. So.
Yeah. Do we have a mic nearby?
Hi. Can you talk a little bit more about the session? What goes on? Is it more like a therapy session? Do you take patients to a specific place and have them face specific issues, or do you just let them, bring up whatever comes up?
Just to confirm, did you hear the explanation I gave at the beginning, and you're asking for a little more detail about what we're doing?
I came in a little bit late. I don't know how. I came in 4:15, so I don't know.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat too much, but just to sort of recap, participants go through a pre-screening kind of at different levels. If you meet the basic inclusion-exclusion criteria, need an MRI of the brain to show no brain metastases. And then there's a sort of pre-first session period where they meet with one or both of the doctors, have some psychological evaluation, and they do some intention setting work. So they usually come in prepped with a little pre-work, and they're encouraged to, and sometimes it's appropriate to bring in photos of significant people in their lives. One woman brought in a beautiful tanka that we hung on the wall. Some people brought in original artwork, again, allowing for some leeway in terms of variability. We always dress the room. In fact, the one participant who was a burner came in the room and said, "Can we get this bed out of here and just put the mattress on the floor?" And then we ran around to all the empty rooms in the ward there or the research center, and grabbed all the extra pillows and created a little nest. So we do what we can to make the environment as conducive to a productive session as possible. And they're admitted the night before the study. There's, blood and urine tests and the usual. They get weighed to confirm the appropriate dosage and so on. Things you'd kind of expect. And we arrive in the morning, check in with them, talk, see what's going on, see if there have been any recent changes. Because with advanced stage cancer patients, with one participant was in a pretty good place for the first session, and then got very negative news about her blood results showed that her cancer was showed that this person's cancer was advancing significantly. So they were in a very different place, and that, again, requiring the skills of the DJ, we kind of needed to tailor the session accordingly. There's kind of a little opening grounding ritual before the substance is consumed. Usually there's a little period of time of just kind of chatting and whatnot. When it seems like the appropriate time, fairly soon, they're encouraged, but not forced, to put on the eye shades and headphones. And most people have been, I was surprised when I began this study. I said, "Are you kidding? People are going to be comfortable tripping?" in a hospital with 3 people staring at them. I mean, we're in pretty close proximity, and I was amazed at how comfortable it becomes for everybody once the session is underway. And we do try to, the extent possible, try to maintain an attentive body posture and a readiness to respond. You know, you don't bring romance novels and, how you doing? You know. The sessions last about 6 hours. There's some data collected about vital signs and blood pressure and whatnot. And again, some people are chatty. Some people have epiphanies. I was going to try to get through this talk without using that word, but it happens. Sometimes it's a cathartic experience, and someone may burst out in tears and have a crying jag and be kind of nonverbal for an extended period of time, and you just try to use your best discretion about, is it appropriate to sit on the bed and maybe put an arm around a shoulder, offer a hand to hold. Sometimes I'll tell people, you know, we'll decide on a signal if you want your hand held, but sometimes it's hard for people to ask, so you just, you know, try to respond the way you would want somebody to respond to you if you were in a similar situation. The music, we start with kind of reasonably appropriate come-on music, something, you know, maybe a little more on the Enya tip, you know, if it's appropriate for that person. Some people, that's the last thing they'd ever want to hear. Some people love it. They could go the whole session with Enya. And then as the effect of the drug is really coming on, we tend to try to play something a little more driving. When they're working, we're playing working music, usually. We don't go too dark. We don't go too leading or emotional or sobby or anything like that. And we do have these check-ins where we can take cues from them, you know, a bit, maybe a brief chat, and then, all right, you know, go back in, we'll check in a while later. And they're not just released on their own. Someone needs to be there to pick them up and take them home. And then there is a series of instruments or questionnaires, surveys, that they begin 2 weeks prior. They fill out little pain cards that measure the level of pain that they're having and mood. So the monitoring and the data collection aspect begins a couple of weeks in advance. There's some stuff you fill out on the day. There's a pack you fill out the next day, another one 2 weeks later. And when you're done with your second session, there are 6 monthly questionnaires, and I phone everybody once a month. How's it going? We need to check for any adverse events that have come up, just like any other drug. You know, if they have bronchitis, we need to know if everybody who's in this study develops bronchitis 3 weeks later. You know, it's not likely to happen, but and also any other medications, any concomitant medications that they're taking, we track those as well. Again, following the typical protocols of, you know, other studies for other drugs.
We're running out of time.
Okay.
Our next speaker has actually arrived.
Very good.
So
May
I would like to thank you so much for coming all this way out into the boondocks to help us. So thank you very much, Alicia.
Thank you, and everyone who.
And thank all of you for
possible.
joining in here too. I know we've been kind of huddling here out of the wind and